Okay, this video is going to be about evidence gathering, so it's for the same prompt that we T-tapped earlier, and we know that the purpose for reading is to find evidence that speaks to both style and developments in creation so that we can maybe tease out a relationship between those two things. So let's just start from the beginning. We'll try to make this quick. So source one, ready-made clothing. Before the American Civil War, ready-made apparel existed, but its variety was limited. Coats, jackets, and undergarments were only available in predetermined sizes. Most clothing was made by tailors, by individuals, or by family members at home. I want to highlight that because to me that speaks to clothing creation. So at the beginning, you had to have a tailor, individuals, or you made your clothing at home. The Civil War was a pivotal event in the historical development of men's ready-made clothing. At the outset of the Civil War, most uniforms were custom-made. So most uniforms were custom-made in workers' homes under government contract. As the war continued, however, manufacturers started to build factories that could quickly and efficiently meet the growing demands of the military. So build factories, because again, I'm still thinking about development in clothing creation. These factories were able to make uniforms for a fraction of the cost of home sewers. Mass-producing uniforms necessitated the development of standard sizes. So mass-producing, now this right here, standard sizes, this may actually get into style a little bit. So mass-producing uniforms necessitated the development of standard sizes. So if you can make them really quickly, you need to make them at a certain size so that you're not wasting time. Measurements taken of soldiers revealed that certain sets of measurements tended to recur with predictable regularity. There were certain ratios of shoulder-to-waist measurements that occurred more frequently than others. After the war, these measurements were used to create the first commercial sizing scales for men. Today, these ratios persist in names of fits and cuts in men's suits, shirts, and denim jackets. A men's store might offer a slim fit, a classic fit, and a relaxed fit to suit various tastes and body types. Thank God for the classic fit, or the relaxed fit, rather. The mass production of women's clothing developed more slowly. Women's outfits were generally custom-made well into the 1920s. So women's outfits were custom-made into the 1920s. This talks about kind of very special kind of clothing options. You had to make it to fit a particular woman. At that point, a number of factors came together to contribute to the success of women's ready-made apparel industry. New industrial production techniques were developed, driving supply, and the advertising industry rose in prominence, driving sales. Most importantly, demand was created in the form of the rising urban professional class. Single and married women found themselves in new relationships to domestic life, work life, and fashion. Many spent less time at home, and all associated handmade clothes with older, more rural lifestyle. They no longer shopped at the town's general store for bolts of calico fabric. Chain stores and mail-order catalogs offered multiple ways to access the new clothes. Ready-made articles of clothing were portrayed as modern and fashionable. So, modern and fashionable, getting to style there, if not sturdy. The new consumer industries were rapidly redefining the way Americans viewed mass-manufactured goods. The purchase of mass-produced clothing was sometimes seen as a loss of individuality. However, American women began to accept ready-made merchandise as convenient and affordable. They were up-to-date fashion items that could be easily replaced as the styles changed. So again, I'm thinking about style right here, up-to-date. Well, easily replaced as styles changed, so that they're going to talk about it here. Making clothes more quickly meant styles did change more frequently as well. So in other words, if the development of clothing creation, if you start being able to make clothes more rapidly, then you can make new clothes and new styles more rapidly, so the styles would start to change more quickly as development became more rapid. It took far less time for a designer to sketch a pattern and have an item made than ever before. However, the new ready-made clothing often fit poorly. A tailor might take 24 measurements when making a men's suit. For example, determining the distance from the base of the neck to the middle of the shoulders is critical for an exact fit. Women's clothes are less straightforward, and early male pattern makers did not know where to begin. Each manufacturer created its own unique and sometimes arbitrary, so that means like meaningless, right? So not really serious, sizing system. These systems were based on inaccurate body data or no body data at all. Different manufacturers frequently labeled garments of widely different dimensions the same size. This situation resulted in additional expenses for alterations. It also meant large volumes of returned merchandise. This meant more work for the consumer or tailor and for shop clerks and mail-order catalogs. It also meant overall increased costs for the consumer of ready-to-wear clothing. It was not until 1937 that the U.S. Department of Agriculture considered conducting a study of women's body measurements. They helped create a standard sizing system for the entire industry to follow clothing creation standard sizing system. Not all modern companies follow the same size chart, but nearly all have standardized which types of measurements determine their sizes. If a woman knows just 3 measurements, she can order from almost any retailer in the world. Okay, so again, you can go back and look at the video to see which sources or which pieces I highlighted. I'm just trying to get things to talk about style and creation as much as I can. Source 2, tailoring. Clothes before the Industrial Revolution were made and worn very differently than they are now. For the most part, families made their own clothing by hand from fabric. Now, this corroborates information we had in that first article. Fabric was intricate and time-consuming to make. As a result, it was a highly prioritized commodity. Merchants made their wealth in transporting fine fabrics and threads. In places like Scotland, fabrics called tartans showed clan affiliation. There you are. Polynesians spent hours beating plant fibers and tree bark into tapa cloth. For Hawaiians, part of this practice took on religious significance and was conducted in sacred spaces. Before mass production, fabric itself, the finished product as well as the process, could be very meaningful. While time, effort, and money were put into making or obtaining fabric, creating a garment was much less complicated. Almost every culture had some version of a tied rope or tunic, essentially a loose fabric that draped and was secured by a belt, pin, or sash. In the Middle Ages, such ties and belts helped the Europeans to keep improperly fitted clothing secure on their bodies. Most clothing, especially those of the lower middle classes, would be considered very oversized by modern standards. They were generally made out of 1 or 2 pieces of cloth to minimize waste. So this is to do with clothing creation, right? And clothing style. So tied rope or tunic, loose fabric. So clothing would be considered, at this time, would be considered very oversized by modern standards because they really couldn't make fabric that fit a specific size, which goes back to what we learned in the earlier passages where you could start using factories to standardize everyone's sizes. So the development of creation has to have something to do with style in terms of the options that you get. With the Renaissance's changes in art and society became more fitted clothing. These garments were made by sewing several pieces of fabric together. The wealthy had clothes made by tailors who often customized their own patterns, but without closures like zippers and buttons, people often had to be sewn into their clothes. Laces and corsets eventually solved some of these problems, but it was still incredibly difficult to get dressed back then. By the 17th century, crafting and tailoring of Western clothing required more skill as designs became more complex. Intricate scenes of animals or flowers were embroidered by hand. They took hours to complete and were a sign of the wearer's wealth. Gemstones might be sewn into the collar or sleeve of a very fine garment. A fine cloth was only as good as its cut and decoration, and a man or woman could make their fortune on the strength of these designs. At the height of the 18th century, French fashion garments were truly works of art. They took days and dozens of hands to complete, with each person contributing hours of specialized skill. So that seems to be important in terms of clothing creation. The materials themselves came from miles away. Some, like silk, even came from other countries. It also seems to be saying here that wealth had a big part to play, and who got what kind of clothing. I don't know if that'll matter later, but it's just something I'm noticing as I'm reading. Eventually, political and social movements led to more restrained and practical clothing, and as embellishments and flashy fabrics fell out of use even among aristocrats, that's wealthy people again, fit became increasingly more important in the 19th and 20th century. Fit became increasingly more important in the 19th and 20th century. Instead of voluminous tunics or pants that tied, men began to wear suits. While suspenders were used for many years, pants had to fit accurately. Women wore trimmer dresses with buttons that allowed for more fitted looks. They put aside petticoats meant to give skirts more volume, and many favored flowing looks over corseted ones. Clothing became a natural extension of the body rather than its decoration or disguise. I like that. So that's definitely clothing style. And trimmer clothing, petticoats. So this is definitely style. Countries like England became renowned for their tailors, and wealthy traveled to have their clothes made. Tailoring was still expensive and not an option for all. Making a single coat might require several trips to the tailor, difficult for those who lived far away. The wealthy could travel into town or across provinces to attend several fittings a month. It was much less expensive to make clothing in the home, and if you could afford it, have a tailor help with the more complicated portions. Most often, family members were each other's tailors, pinning and hemming in the home. While simple fabrics were much less expensive than before, clothes were still altered, mended, and handed down as children grew. Clothing was still not seen as replaceable or disposable. Eventually, ready-made clothing would be available, but that brought its own set of problems. It would be several decades until fitted, comfortable clothing was truly affordable. So, affordability. This one really talks about money a lot. Advancements in modern clothing. Rapid advancements in computer technology during the late 20th and early 21st century have given today's fashion designers unprecedented freedom to express their creativity. In previous generations, garments were designed by hand using pencil sketches and traditional math-based pattern sizing. Today, designers often have computer-aided design software at their disposal to determine textile weaves and sizing designs. CAD software allows them to view designs of clothing on virtual models of various shapes and sizes. This makes for a much more efficient garment design process, saving companies both time and resources that would have otherwise been spent on manually creating and adjusting prototypes. The impact of CAD software on everyday clothing is becoming more prevalent as the software is linked to 3D printing technology. While other industries such as aerospace and architecture have been using this technology for decades, it has now started to spread to the world of fashion. Designers have been experimenting with 3D printed apparel, and this could revolutionize the experience of buying clothes for the average consumer. For example, a swimwear company can now offer custom-designed bathing suits on its website using nylon and 3D printer to print out each order to a customer's body shape and measurements. In addition to the use of 3D printers by industry specialists, machines for home printing are becoming more and more affordable. If this trend continues, it will allow customers to print out objects like bracelets in a matter of minutes from the comfort of their homes. So style, but also creation. Though it may be a while before anyone can print his or her own complete wardrobe, the ability to create customized clothing is becoming more of a reality as technology evolves. One day we may all be wearing our own one-of-a-kind, perfectly tailored clothes. So this is an interesting idea. So it seems to me, reading this as I close, that technology has a big impact on the development or the relationship between style and clothing creation. So your source 2 seems to be the earliest chronologically, where you're really talking about pre-industrial means of making clothing. Source 1 gets into the industrial era, talking about factories and their ability to impact what clothes can be made. And then the last one is definitely about the modern era, so the rise of 3D printing and the ability to specifically tailor clothes again. There's all kind of relationships to see with this. So clothing starting out being very specialized to the individual based upon money, to very standardized based upon technology and factories that could pop out standard models of clothing, and then finally back to individualized again with the rise of 3D printing. There's all kinds of relationships to make here. But if you go back and look over this video, you can pause it as many times as you need to look at the highlights that I've made. But think about how all of these highlights build this picture of technology changing the kind of styles that are even possible to wear. Okay, so hope this was informational. Again, pause this a lot because I know I had to go fast to get it under the 15-minute YouTube limit. But I did it. So there that goes. Anyway, that's all for now. Bye-bye.